Well, we're really thrilled about this third panel. You know, last year we talked about research and policy as well, and we took a more broad strokes approach. We talked a little bit about the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act, which was brand new. This year we get to dive way deeper into the research with Bradford and learn about how that National Plan to End Parkinson's has actually evolved. I'm going to start with Bradford. We often hear headlines about breakthroughs in Parkinson's research, gene discoveries, biomarkers, new drug targets. From your vantage point at the Michael J. Fox Foundation, what advances right now feel game-changing?
So thanks very much, and thanks also for having me out here. It's a really beautiful place, and I'm really excited to have an opportunity to come talk to you today. So in terms of what is most exciting, I think this is a really interesting question because it depends on what time of day you ask me, honestly. But what I would say is that really we're at a time in Parkinson's research where more than at any time in my career, there are more drugs entering trials. There's more understanding of the underlying biology of Parkinson's disease. We're looking into risk factors and everything else. And all of these things are really starting to yield results in a way that they just haven't previously. And that, I think, speaks to all the different people that are committed to this space and are working so hard to drive the research forward. I think that when we look across the field, we understand that more and more we're needing to work on all these levels at once. You know, there was a time where the foundation was quite small. There was a time where the Parkinson's research community was quite small. And the dramatic expansion of people that are focused on this, that are also committed to driving the research forward, is really enabling us to really see change in our lifetime. So it's really an exciting time. And I think that enthusiasm is infused across the Parkinson's research space.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into some research. We hear a lot about genetic research, but we also hear that very few Parkinson's cases are considered genetic. Can you break down genetic risk and talk us through why researchers emphasize large-scale genetics and data sharing efforts?
Yeah, sure. So really exciting question, and one that's near and dear to my heart. You know, as you mentioned, I work on a couple genetics projects, and that's one of the things I lead at the foundation. So genetics, of course, are key not only to Parkinson's, but also to every other aspect of our biology. So you may be aware that you can go and you can get genetic testing for some conditions. Some of those are very, very clear answers. You know, you go in, you take a test, and you get a result, and that result tells you whether you have a risk factor for a disease. With Parkinson's, we know that there are not so many very strong genetic predictors, right? And overall, if we look at every patient who's diagnosed, perhaps 20% of people have a known genetic risk factor. So that's actually quite low compared to some other diseases. If you look at a disease like Huntington's, these are diseases where if you are positive for those genetic risk factors, you're extremely likely to develop the disease, and it's a question of when. With Parkinson's, there are people who have these genetic markers, and they may never go on to develop disease. So it's important to understand that when you hear about genetic testing for Parkinson's. But it's also important to understand that in addition to clinical testing, genetics it provides us with an incredible tool for how we can really apply biological research to ask questions. And when I say that, what I mean is genetics provides us this roadmap, this blueprint, right? And it allows us to go back and start understanding how these different systems work together in our body, how they may go wrong in disease. And so when we find that there's a new genetic risk factor that's identified, and that's part of the purpose of the Global Parkinson's Genetics Program you mentioned, this is just a starting point. And it means that we can then go back, we can dive into that biology, and we can start asking experimental questions about that biology. And that's how we really get things into the clinical pipeline. So that's a really exciting piece of what we do. So yeah, it's important to remember that there's a lot of different forms of genetic risk for Parkinson's. It's not just one. That can really tell people a little bit about how it may affect others in your family, but it also can tell us a little bit more about how you may be developing Parkinson's, how other people might be at risk for Parkinson's, and again, help us frame that downstream research that's so important.
Well, how can people participate in genetic testing?
I'm so glad you asked. So, most genetic testing these days takes place in a clinician's office, right? So you can go in and you can ask your clinician, I'm at risk for this, or I believe that this happens in my family. And we talk about genetic risk. Often people kind of don't recognize that they may be at risk, but if you start talking to your family members, they may have received health results that might be informative to you. There are direct-to-consumer genetic tests as well. You can order a kit in the mail. Usually you spit in a tube or something similar. And you can get some answers from those types of programs. But the best way, if you have specific questions about your health, is really to talk to a clinician, because they can connect you with very high-quality results. They can ensure that you have access to a genetic counselor, which will help you interpret what those results come back. The last thing you want is just to get a letter in the mail or an email that just says, oh, you're at risk for something. That doesn't tell you a whole lot. You just often need someone that can really help you walk through it. And that's an important piece of genetic testing.
Interesting. So is there a sense in the Parkinson's community that the more we kind of discern and understand of our genetics, the higher the likelihood that genetics plays a role in Parkinson's, that 15-20% might actually jump up once we know more about our genomic markers and breakdown?
Absolutely. So not only do we anticipate that number is going to go up, we know it's going up. And just in the last couple of years, actually, we've had some really exciting findings. So we've learned that in addition to the known risk variants, these mutations that you may have heard of, we're finding new ones within the Fox Foundation's associated studies. So this is exciting because this means these are new starting points. These are new starting points for biomarkers. These are new starting points for therapeutics. They're new starting points for us to understand risk. And all of that helps us treat and prevent people from developing Parkinson's in the first place.
So this question was not on the list I provided you, but hopefully it's not too much of a curveball. As you're talking, I'm thinking, how did the Fox Foundation choose or begin to explore genomics as a pathway for Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, many years ago, really the scientific community started to really coalesce around these genetic programs. And the reason for this is that because we wanted to build out these big roadmaps, we understood that would inform not just on a single disease, but on many diseases, perhaps all diseases that face us as humans. As we have moved these programs forward, we've learned a lot more about them, but we've also learned about kind of the limitations of how we do that type of work. These are opportunities for us to expand that map, to really start pinpointing all the things that are going to go wrong. There are also opportunities for us to think about how the rest of the research that we look at is put in context. And one of those pieces, as we think about new variants being added, is also about what comes off, right? Like which of these pieces might not be as significant as we originally thought. And that also has to do with things like environmental risk, right? So we all begin life with a certain genetic code. We retain that genetic code throughout our life, other than a few cases like cancer and things like that. But for the most part, whatever you're born with, you keep that forever. And so that risk is set as soon as you're born. And so there's all these other factors that we think really mediate how that risk turns into disease, how that risk moves forward to actually lead to an outcome. And so the more investment in genetics has helped us get there. So the Fox Foundation has continued to support this. We're looking at it with newer technologies that allow not only test for a couple of specific variants, but also for big changes in the genome that are undetectable with those old technologies. And we think that all of this is really going to help us inform our understanding of disease so that we can make progress.
Well, I certainly just learned a lot. And I'm thinking, we have this kind of number in our heads that 15% of Parkinson's cases are genetic and 85% fall under this environmental umbrella. So given that so many Parkinson's cases are considered to have environmental causes, can you jump into what we know about the environment and how that influences Parkinson's?
Sure. So I might have just a small correction first, because it's important to kind of frame it. So you mentioned that maybe 15 or 20% are thought to have genetic risk factors. Even those likely have some mediating effect of our environment, of our lifestyle. The greatest risk factor for Parkinson's is not genetics, it's age. So age is the biggest risk factor, and it faces all of us. The environment is an interesting piece of it, because the environment, is just a nice way of saying exposures, many exposures throughout our life. So those might be drugs that we've taken in our lifetime. Those might be pesticides or chemicals that we've been exposed to. They might be the food we eat. So all of these things come together into that genetic picture. So most Parkinson's cases statistically are what's called idiopathic, which just means without known cause. So some of that is likely environmental, some of that is likely unexplored or poorly understood genetics, and other pieces may just have to do, again, with the random mediating effects of age and things like that. So there's a lot of things coming together. So I know that doesn't answer your question. I'll get back to it. But so when we think about the environment, again, we're really trying to dial in on which pieces of your lifestyle are most significant to disease and disease risk. So we want to understand, if you've grown up in this area of the country, you might be exposed to agricultural chemicals. If you had experience in military service, you might have been exposed to industrial solvents or things like that. If you've worked in a factory, the same. And so all of these have different risk factors. And as I said, even things like diet might have an effect. And so the Fox Foundation just recently has supported a study to better understand the role of tobacco products as well as caffeine and other dietary pieces in Parkinson's, because we think those may be critical pieces of the puzzle. And ultimately, all of this helps inform on our understanding of how we might get to cures.
Well, I'm going to return to you in a moment, Bradford, but I want to turn to Julie because we are talking about some of these environmental issues, and this comes in to play with policy. And we have heard a little bit about the research priorities of the Fox Foundation, but how does the Fox Foundation choose its policy priorities, and how do you see that feeding into the research priorities?
Yeah, so I would say to start, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, just to kind of set the stage, we don't receive any government funding to fund our research, but what we do is a lot of advocacy in the hope that we can partner with the government so that we can help supplement each other's funding for Parkinson's research. I would say we have three main priorities at the foundation. And this is at both the state and federal level. It's really, like I said, and you'll hear me say this a lot, really the crux of it is getting funding for Parkinson's research from the governments. We're about 10 years behind Alzheimer's in that space, but we're making progress towards that, which I'll go into a little more later. But we're behind. It's kind of a disease that unfortunately is kind of getting forgotten about in that bigger, NIH space. So that's one part. And we're seeing a lot of success so far at the state level at getting state Parkinson's funds set up. There was a big win in Texas last year. We're hoping California can follow suit. So funding first, access to care. So understanding this larger care ecosystem, insurance, assisted living, kind of what do patients need? Where can we partner again with the public sphere to make improvements there? And then thirdly, going back to what you were discussing with Bradford about the environment is, regulations around things like paraquat, which is a highly toxic pesticide that's used in a lot of agriculture. It's banned in over 70 countries, including the countries that manufacture it, which is kind of ironic. Yep, but they send it to us still. So it's used in the US, it's used here in California. And so, we see a lot of people in the Central Valley that have Parkinson's and start having symptoms young. So, we know that there's clearly this connection between the onset of symptoms and something like paraquat. And so where policy comes in is really the government is the thing that's going to have to put those regulations in and banning something like paraquat and providing, my policy colleagues, because they get this question, is what are the alternatives to paraquat? And they've confirmed there are alternatives. If there are any farmers in the room, you can, confirm a little more about that. But so that's really where we need partnership from the government. And then that's where we come in is like, well, why is something like paraquat so damaging? And then that's where the people come in. Really advocacy in our policy work is we have these amazing numbers and data and the work from researchers. But this kind of helps representatives see the people and the lived experiences behind all the science and that hard data. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And just to bring it home, we know that paraquat is used in Coachella Valley. We know that East Coachella Valley has a very large-scale farming community, and there were tests conducted on the soil in East Coachella Valley, found that the contamination of toxins in East Coachella Valley is 95th percentile, some of the most toxic soil in California in terms of pesticide saturation. And 4 of the top 5 chemicals that were pregnant have been linked to Parkinson's. So this is an issue here for Coachella Valley as well as for Central Valley, as well as for the rest of the United States. So I know the Fox Foundation has been busy in California. What's some of the legislation or policy work that you're doing right now?
Yes, so this is something I'm excited about. You may not have heard about it quite yet in the news because this is a measure that we're going to put in front of the California Senate and the State Assembly. It's called Senate Bill 895. So keep an eye out for 895 eventually. This bill would establish and I want to make sure I get the full name right, the California Foundation for Science and Health Research. So basically, this would be setting up a major fund, millions and millions of dollars, to basically infuse funding into hospitals, into university research labs. And then also, there's going to be a little bit of a focus on neurological disease as well. And especially because someone like the Michael J. Fox Foundation with a Parkinson's interest, if we're the ones that are getting really loud about it, that's going to help us kind of drive that funding where it needs to go. You may have heard of a really big bill in Texas that established a $3 billion fund in that state for neurological disease research, particularly Parkinson's, dementia, and Alzheimer's. At first, it was just supposed to be dementia research, which is extremely important and obviously a lot of crossover. But we made sure that Parkinson's was also part of that conversation. So, the more that these bigger states can kind of set the tone, and California, as we all know, being Californians, is such a trendsetter, for lack of a better term, but we've always been at the forefront of innovation. And so I think if we can get this bill passed, show a successful funding model, investing in universities and, teams that are struggling with funding. So I think, that can have a domino effect in the rest of the country.
And my understanding is that this bill is in some ways a response to federal funding threats to scientific research. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about how the Fox Foundation engages with the uncertainty of federal funding and how you work to offset those impacts, knowing that you don't seek federal funding, but you're definitely one of the major players in the research game?
Certainly, yes. And I will eventually punt this to Bradford, who's actually working with those research teams. But yeah, we have a really great new head of our policy team who's a former I believe he ran for Congress in Minnesota at one point. So he's very knowledgeable how all of this works. And when I first met him, he made a really good point to us, kind of as the administration was changing. We didn't know what was going to happen, as with any administration. And he said, you just have to adjust strategy. Maybe one year it makes a lot more sense to focus on federal policy, which is something that we did in 2024, and we're continuing to work on that, which I'll go more into later. But, if we're seeing the signs that we're investing our efforts at the state level might be more fruitful, then that's what we're going to do. But the mission at the end of the day remains the same. We're just have to be flexible and nimble in how we do it. So, seeing the cuts at the federal level, from a policy perspective, that's really where the state-focused work we're finding is really important and really successful. And yes, like I said earlier, the Michael J. Fox Foundation doesn't get any government funding. So thankfully, our foundation has remained healthy, which is great because, we partner with university research teams and help fund those projects as well. We just are now working in this ecosystem where we know there's a bit more of an onus on us to have to step up to the plate a little more. And I think Bradford can speak more on sort of the bridge funding projects that we've started.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, we have a long history of operating in a funding ecosystem. It's not that it's just one funder. No one funder can solve all these problems. It is a tremendously challenging time to run a lab in scientific research, and especially in a space like Parkinson's, where the number of those labs is not as large as it is in some different research communities. So we're doing what we can to fill the gaps, to work with researchers to help steward their projects forward, but we can't do it alone. And I would say, we have a long-standing history of partnering with federal funders. We actually fund research that happens within NIH's institutes, because we care about that work and because they've been reliable partners. But overall, it's important to just recognize that anytime there are sudden changes in the funding ecosystem, it really changes the landscape and it really threatens the work that's already underway. So our priorities have really been around trying to fill the gaps where we can, to plug those holes in the pipeline, to try to keep the most pressing research moving forward. And we're going to do that to the limit of our resources and abilities. And one way that we're doing that is through this bridge program. The goal of the bridge program is that we are working with people who have projects that are being threatened by a loss of NIH federal support. And we're trying to find some supplementary support to help them get them to the next stage. We may not be able to fund an entire project. We likely won't. We certainly can't fund all of them. But if there are good ideas out there, if there are projects underway, we want to make sure that that work moves forward. We don't want to see that progress lost, and we don't want to see that opportunity kicked down the road 3 or 4 years before they might have access to additional support.
Well, that's great. I'm going to keep the focus on you for another moment, Bradford. And switching back to research, there's a lot of excitement around the idea of personalized precision medicine in Parkinson's. How close are we to tailoring treatments based on, the genetics that we already talked about, the biology or the disease subtype, and what still needs to happen to get there?
So it depends. In one sense, we are there. We're in that age. We are already looking at people's specific biology in terms of the diagnosis. We do genetic testing, for example. We also now have a number of drugs that are entering the clinical trial pipeline that are focused on people that have specific genetic variations, right? So these are opportunities that we see to really help catalyze the community around that, to drive that research space forward. And we think that we may have a shorter timeline to get those drugs into the hands of patients. But it's important to understand that we also think that those drugs may work for broader populations of patients. You might not have to have, for example, a LRRK2 mutation or a synuclein mutation to benefit from drugs for those programs. So all of these are telling us that we are seeing progress and that progress may be most informative or may be fastest in application for some populations. But as we learn more about disease subtypes, as we learn more about these genetics, again, we see this space moving forward really quickly. And we've seen progress both at the clinical stage and also the bench biology stage. So it's very exciting.
So break it down a little bit more, the idea of personalized precision medicine. What does that look like for someone's treatment plan? What should they expect out of that type of medicine for themselves?
So that's a great question. So if you're receiving medication today, you might be, for example, a subject in a clinical trial, a participant in a clinical trial. And so this might be a criteria that allows you to join that trial, have access to medications that are not yet on the market. That's one way it might affect you. Another way it might affect you is that just as you work with your current clinician or your movement disorder specialist to tailor a drug regimen around your symptoms, as we learn more specifically about these potential subtypes of Parkinson's or how genetics might affect it, we may learn more about this type of drug tends to work for this type of patient. At the end of the day, you're always going to be working with your care team to help build that out, to understand how your symptoms are affecting you, to understand where the gaps are that they're not addressing your symptoms. And we think that precision medicine is going to be a key piece of that.
Well, I'm going to bring up another buzzword in the Parkinson's research world, biomarkers, like alpha-synuclein. Why are these important for Parkinson's research? Can you share any recent trials or information about why are we talking so much about biomarkers right now?
Sure.
Maybe start with what is a biomarker?
I was going to say, let's start there. So what is a biomarker? So just as most of you in the room have gone in at some point, you've had a blood test for cholesterol, you might have had a hormonal pregnancy test. These are biological tests that tell us what's going on inside your body. There are also things like imaging biomarkers. If you take a fall and you get an x-ray, that's kind of a biomarker as well, because it allows us to look inside your body, see what's going on. That's valuable for diagnosis, obviously. It's also really valuable for other things like treatment, right? And so to support drug development and to make sure that we have treatments that are moving forward, a lot of these treatments are really going to be relying more and more on biomarkers. So to go back to the alpha-synuclein biomarker, that we had a really exciting announcement just a couple of years ago. I hope some of you have already heard about it, but briefly what I would say is that for the first time ever, there's a biomarker you can go in and they take a couple drops of cerebral spinal fluid through a spinal tap, and they can actually test that in a vial in the lab, and they can assess whether or not you have clumping of this protein that is tied to Parkinson's pathology. And if you're positive for that test, it gives us confidence in the diagnosis that you have Parkinson's disease versus something that might look like Parkinson's. But it also tells us that you are in a state where we believe you have this disease. So if you imagine that you're running a clinical trial, for example, you want to be absolutely certain that the people that you are testing a drug on actually have the disease you're trying to treat. That is the simplest way I can put it. So we think that this is a catalyst for progress in drug development. We think it's a catalyst for our ability to understand the underlying biology. And ultimately, it also ensures that people have accurate diagnoses as early as possible so they can get treatment.
All right. Well, we field a lot of questions. Here's another buzzword, stem cell research. What are the stem cell studies or treatments that are currently circulating the Parkinson's world? What can you tell us about them?
Sure. So I'm going to tackle this in two ways. One, I want to talk about stem cells as tools, and the second, I want to talk about stem cells as treatments. They're both important. So we'll start with treatments. For many years, we've understood that because Parkinson's is a loss of these dopamine-producing neurons in our brain, deep in our brain, stem cells represent an intriguing opportunity to treat that. Stem cells are present in all of us. Those stem cell populations divide in our body. They become all of our cell types, including those dopamine neurons. So if we could add more dopamine neurons, that would be great, right? We'd have more dopamine. These cells would be working and helping us. Just as we take a medication, these cells might help. So for many years, we have tried this in various ways. We have done transplant studies. We have done synthetic stem cells, if you will. And we've added those to the brains of patients to see if they help. Overall, that's been a challenging space. We have not seen a magic bullet in the form of stem cell treatments. Just as our own neurons might be lost to the damages of Parkinson's disease, those neurons might also be at risk. Like, there's something very specific about Parkinson's that attacks those neurons, and if you add more of those neurons, they're also on the front line. So we don't know that it's going to be that magic bullet. We do think that there remains potential in this space. We continue to follow it, but it's not an area that we invest in very heavily from a research perspective. I also think it's super important, though, to talk about stem cells as tools, because stem cells are an incredible and a unique tool, because what that means is that any of us could take a couple cells from our body, and those could be used to study both our own biology in the context of our genetics, in the context of the environment again, but also could be used to take that and drive it to the next level and really help with drug development and things like that. So we can take those stem cells, we can turn them into different cell types, and we can use that to test drugs, and we can also use it to test the biological mechanisms to help us get to those drugs. So it's a tremendously important tool, and if you have an opportunity to contribute to a study like that, it's a great way to ensure that your own experience is reflected in that research community.
Okay. My next question actually goes right off that, Bradford. Participating in a research trial. It is something that I think actually quite a lot of people in our community are interested about, but sometimes hard to find, sometimes daunting or scary. What should people know?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to get involved in research. You can get involved in a research trial, which is usually testing a therapeutic. You can also get involved in an observational study. So if you want to help, if you want to be a supporter, even if you don't have Parkinson's, you can contribute to a study. If you're in a clinical trial, you are likely to be faced with an interventional option, right? Meaning that you would be taking an experimental medication. You might be taking a medication that's in use for something else to see if it helps with your symptoms. Those experiences vary widely depending on which trial you sign up for, but calling it or looking into a trial does not commit you to participating. So you can always change your mind. The important thing to know is that every trial is a little bit different. They're all designed to test different things. And so it's important to look into those details. A great way to do that is to go to our website. We actually built a really interesting service. It's called Fox Trial Finder. We always talk about it as our Match.com. Match.com for clinical trials. You might not be able to find, you might not find your soulmate on Fox Trial Finder, but you might find a teammate in terms of those opportunities. So it's a really great opportunity. You can look into the details of the trials. You can learn whether you're eligible for it, whether it's happening in your area, whether you have to take a drug, whether you have to travel. All these things are there. That's just something that we provide to the community. We're not involved in the trials. We want to support people having opportunities to participate in research.
Well, I've got a few really good questions here, but first I'm going to turn it to Julie one more time. Speaking of participation, I know there are ways to participate in policy actions that the Fox Foundation is taking. What can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just going back to my point earlier, it's really, advocacy is so important because, again, it puts faces to this disease. It puts personal lived experiences and stories to this disease. And so, there are about 1 million people in the US who have Parkinson's, and that's probably a conservative number because, as I'm sure many of you know, this is a disease that hopefully will get easier to diagnose with these new tools, but there are things that look similar to Parkinson's. So that's probably a conservative number. And so because we know those stories are so important to affecting change at the state and federal level, we have lots of ways you can get involved in advocacy. If you go to our website, you can join our Parkinson's Policy Network. And it's basically you sign up, you get weekly updates from our policy team on what's going on in your area and at the federal level. And it also provides a lot of really great templates for writing to your congresspeople, a script for a call or opportunities to go speak with your representatives. We really try to make it as easy as possible, almost a click of a button for you to get involved. And we know that there are different levels to which people would be comfortable going and speaking, or if they'd want to do it more anonymously and just send an email. We have all of those tools. So yeah, sign up on our website, the Parkinson's Policy Network, and that's the easiest way you can get involved. And then there's a whole team of us at the foundation where we can speak to you one-on-one if you have a certain question about your district or whatever it might be. So Parkinson's Policy Network on the Michael J. Fox website is the home for that.
Let's touch really quickly on a policy victory that the Parkinson's community had a year ago and get an update on it. The National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. I don't know if that's still what it's called. It's changed names once or twice. Yes. But this was a major effort to get federal involvement in research for Parkinson's on par with research for Alzheimer's and other similar conditions. What can you tell us a year in?
At the largest scale, the goal for that law is to establish more, again, advocacy for the Parkinson's community within the halls of the NIH and HHS and all of the CDC, all those health-related departments. And the first step of implementing that, and also, having voices to direct where federal funding should go for research and how to most effectively use it. First step of that is to build a special council of experts, so doctors or people who work with the community, just those expert voices, and patients as well, because patients are at the center of everything we do. So we wanted to make sure that there are people on that panel too that can provide that perspective. We now, I think, as of very recently, everyone for that council has been chosen. I don't know who. That is embargoed information at this point. Even I don't know. But that's an exciting step. And it did take some time. We thought we'd be farther at this point and, have had that council for a while. But at least that's where we are right now, is at least those people have been identified. And hopefully they can start jumping into action, meeting with each other, kind of doing an audit of the systems that are in place for that funding. And a part of that plan, I believe, is every year there's going to be a report to the Secretary of HHS on everything that's happened that year and what progress needs to be made and things that can be changed. So yeah. That feels good to me that we at least have that expert panel put together now.
All right. The train is out of the station.
The train is out of the station, finally, yes.
Well, let's dive into some of these questions. First, great question for Bradford. Is most research geared toward drug development or towards disease origins right now?
So I would say they're kind of the same in the sense. Really, when we look at the research space writ large, everything boils down to drug development in some way. So when we think about the origins of the disease, we're not just curious about that. It's not just kind of a scientific curiosity. We really want to understand it so that we can treat it. So it's kind of an artificial divide. What I would say is the Fox Foundation really supports research across this spectrum. So we support everything from relatively basic science that's Parkinson's focused all the way into the early stages of clinical programs. That's where we really focus, because in the past that's been referred to as what's called the valley of death, because things don't make it through that pipeline. And so that's where we saw the greatest need, and that's where we support. So we continue to support things to understand the disease, to define it, to really understand measurement in terms of those biomarkers that you mentioned, and then all the way into treatments.
Okay. And you mentioned the word artificial. Next question, does AI play a role in Parkinson's research?
So I get this question a lot. Many of you have heard about AI in recent years, but we've actually been applying these techniques in Parkinson's research even longer than most people have known that it exists. So it's gone by different names in the past. A lot of times we think of this as data analytics, computational biology, machine learning approaches you may have heard of. And for years, we've actually partnered to make sure that we take the highest quality data that is available and apply these emerging analytics. The one thing that's really important to remember is that AI can do a lot of things. It's really an incredible tool, but it is at the end of the day a tool, and it depends very specifically on one thing, and that thing is high quality data. And so we continue to invest in the generation of that data, because ultimately that is the limiting step. That is the limiting thing that really holds us back from being able to apply these approaches and really get to the next stage. So we continue to invest both in that analysis through the AI and then also the underlying data. And we want to also make that data available to the research community.
Do you think AI can help diagnose Parkinson's? And would you trust ChatGPT with the diagnosis?
No.
Okay.
I think it can help. And again, it boils down to it's a tool. But at the end of the day, if you talk to any physician, they'd say, yeah, I go by this set of criteria, but it's a skilled hand that it really takes to understand this disease, to understand how your symptoms may present and how they affect you. Again, I hope that AI will change the face of medicine in terms of providing clinicians with additional resources to practice the best medicine, to know exactly what the state of the field is and what is changing. But I don't think that it's ever going to be a replacement for your physician.
Okay. So we're back to genetics with this question. Dr. Bradford, if you had a child, would you get them tested for Parkinson's genetic biomarkers?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I think it's a very personal question. Everyone kind of feels differently about it. For me, if I'm going to be at risk for something, I want to know, because it might change the decisions I make. For a disease like Parkinson's, it might not change everyone's decision-making throughout their life dramatically, but I think that it's helpful to know. If you know that you have Parkinson's that runs in your family, that you might be at elevated risk, it's something you should talk to your clinician about. You should talk to them about your goals for that information. Is it going to affect how you live your life? But the other thing I would say is that, again, it's not 100%. So just because you are positive for some of these genetic tests, you may never go on to develop Parkinson's. So then it's a personal decision of, do you want to know about the risk? Do you want to plan ahead of that risk? Or instead, do you not want to fret about something that may never come to fruition? I don't want to go into a lot of the genetics here because I know our time is very brief, but I would again just say, some of these genetic links are very strong, and these people tend to get Parkinson's at a very young age, but other variants only affect people later in life. They're less closely associated with the development of the disease, and so I wouldn't want people to lump them all in one bucket.
So stay informed, but don't drive yourself crazy.
That's exactly right.
This is a question for both of you. If we're sitting here 5 or 10 years from now, what would success look like for Parkinson's research, for policy, and for the lived experience of people in this room? Who wants to go first?
I could start. I mean, we can pick any timeline. 10 years is as good as any. To me, what it means is that some of the things that are in the pipeline today are in the hands of patients. Others that aren't in that pipeline hopefully are also in the hands of patients. But I also see a tremendous opportunity for us to drive our understanding of the disease. Because once we really understand what these causes are and what the mechanisms are, that's going to unlock a tremendous new opportunity in terms of developing those treatments and also preventative strategies. And I think that those are key pieces. The other thing is I hope that patients in 10 years are going to have more resources to manage it, not just in terms of treatments, but also in terms of support networks, access to high quality information, which is a priority for us at the foundation, but generally just more understanding and more awareness so they can live their lives.
I would say, if I'm speaking from that policy perspective, I think having a strong implementation of that national plan for Parkinson's would be great, and have that be several years into successful implementation. I think having state funds for Parkinson's research and resources in every state is the dream. And, just again, really from the state level, from the federal level, having such an infusion of funding and kind of exchange of ideas and really efficient communication amongst their researchers and the researchers we work with. I think having just a really, really strong partnership there, which I think we're off to a really great start. And as Bradford knows from the inside, but yeah, that's from that perspective, that feels, and paraquat gone would be a really big one too. More resources for veterans with Parkinson's, because that's another, population that really struggles with it. So just, again, more resources, more funding, stronger partnerships amongst all these parties that are working on Parkinson's. Yeah.
The good news is everyone who is working on these issues within the Parkinson's world is doing it with a huge amount of heart. And I like to think collaboratively as much as possible. Final question or final minute. For individuals and care partners who follow the research closely but still face, the daily uncertainties of living with Parkinson's, what gives you the most hope right now? What hope can we share?
This is, at least like for me, really personally speaking, and I think, again, a little bit of a biased opinion, working for the Michael J. Fox Foundation and really like this being an everyday mission for me. I think it's really, you can take hope in the fact that there are a lot of really, really good, brilliant people working, like Bradford, like the researchers, like the government experts on our team. There are a lot of people who have some sort of personal connection to this disease, really have a personal stake in this work. And I think, again, like it said in my bio, I'm really inspired by that every day. I have gotten teary more than once on this job. So it's really the people behind it that give me a lot of hope. It's the patients I meet. It's the people. And partnering with organizations like PRO, who, while we're doing the research, you're on the ground providing really important resources to people. So again, it comes to the people working on it that give me hope.
I mean, I think it's really hard to overstate how much Michael J. Fox as an individual and the foundation he created has done for Parkinson's awareness. We are the fastest growing neurodegenerative condition in the world. And it wasn't until he pursued this single-minded focus on research and attention that people paid attention. So we're really grateful for not just the star power, but his absolute commitment to bringing genius together. Bradford, I'm going to throw that question to you. What gives you hope?
I think the biggest thing is just the change in the research community during my time working in Parkinson's. I first started a project in Parkinson's back in 2007, so it's a long time, but it's not that long of a time. And when I talk to researchers now, it's just night and day. There's so much more excitement and enthusiasm. I really think that the research community is optimistic for the first time in a long time. That we're really making progress. And I think that has a lot to do with our partners that we're working with in this space. But I think ultimately scientists are, we're driven by data. We're driven by the results. And because we are starting to see exciting results, I think that gives us optimism and enthusiasm. And that's where my hope comes from. Great.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop with the research. Thank you both so much for joining us today.